one common experience, and this is really interesting when people, talk about police violence. One common experience for African American males across this country has been that of an encounter with law enforcement that has been negative. And not that all of those encounters are negative. There have been some that have been very good. When growing up, there was a white policeman who used to sit in front of our house, partly because we were kind of the rowdy ones in the neighborhood. And we got to know him really well, real personally. And there were times he interceded for us with other policemen. And back then, the neighborhoods were segregated. We lived about 3 blocks from the major divide between blacks and white neighborhoods in a small town. And anytime we got caught on the other side, we were stopped and questioned and asked for ID. And, sometimes we'd give his name, they would call him and say everything is okay. But then there are some who just wanted to show you how much authority they did have and how much law and order was on their side. And I guess that's what I hate today too when I hear the term law and order, because if you put that in this context of privilege, you get a whole different meaning of that. Law and order, go back to our constitutional days, slavery was law and order. And they even enacted slave laws to catch fugitive slaves because it was law and order. So when you hear people talk about all lives matter, it just rings that bell over and over again that sure, all lives matter except you. We're not talking about you. You're the exception, right? You're part of that group like Native Americans we came in to commit genocide against. And that's why there's so few Native Americans now. Racism, particularly white racism in its ugly form, was horrible. To destroy whole tribes of people, right? And blacks, to bring them over. And the Europeans talked about how bad it was to travel in ships from Europe to America. Imagine stacked at the bottom of a boat, laying down the whole time 18 inches away and packed body to body through the ship, and only being brought out occasionally to be doused with salt water on your open wounds. Imagine how that would feel. So do all lives matter? We hear law and order and we hear all lives matter, and it makes you feel one more time that you're being set on a shelf somewhere. Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1965, I believe it was, wait from the white community invariably means no. There's not this physical presence of an apartheid-like government and lifestyle that exists when I grew up, when I had to use separate bathrooms and there were separate lines for blacks and whites, and we had to go upstairs and sit in the balcony in the movie theater. Those things are very present. We had to look down when we were talking to white people. I can remember my dad going into the bank to deposit a small check, had to stand in a separate line, and this white banker came up in his three-piece suit and called my dad boy. John boy, how you doing today? And I looked at my dad like, he's a man, but I'm not going to say anything, but I just looked at him and he just shook his head at me like that. And he said, I'm doing fine. My family and I were just driving across campus looking at things, and we were pulled over by the Fresno State Police, and, they were questioning us, and they said that I had a broken taillight. But when they came up to the car and were telling me my taillight was broken, he had his hand on his pistol, on his sidearm, as he walked up to the car. It was me, my wife, and our 3 kids at the time. My daughter tells that story. She remembers it quite well. This feeling of intimidation that hit her, of a mental fear of what's going to happen. And you try to be as polite as you can, but here you have someone in their tone and in their approach is highly disrespecting you and making you feel like that man made my dad feel in the bank, boy. How do you respond? So you just sit there and you take it. And then we drive off. As soon as I get off campus, I pull over, my taillight's not busted. It's like, okay, so it's all right for law enforcement to lie and harass people they think or they're profiling as a possible criminal suspect, but what about a family that's in a car? Probably the worst was when my son and I were on our way to a Black Leaders Conference, Christian Leader Conference at Fresno Pacific. And my son and I were driving together. We were in our suits, dressed up. I was going to speak a little bit. And just as we're driving down Cedar, we're surrounded by 12, maybe 14 police cars. They immediately pull us over, lights blaring, helicopters going overhead. yelling commands, get out of the car, get out of the car. Well, first it was turn your car off and drop your keys out, no explanation. The officers are out with their guns drawn and they're surrounding us in a 360-degree circle with guns drawn. And I'm here with my 17-year-old son. We're looking down the barrel of these firearms, on our way to a Christian conference. So we dropped the keys out. Then they asked us to put our hands out the window. We did. And then they came over and grabbed my son and snatched him out of the car and threw him on the ground and handcuffed him. That was about enough for me. So I got out of the car. I said, what in the world are you doing? Why are you doing this? I demand to know why you stopped us. And a female officer at that point put her gun right probably 3 inches from my nose and pulled the hammer back and said, get back in the car now. And I refused to. I don't know what came to mind at this point, why I was doing that, but it's so funny when we think about it now. My words to her were, by gosh, doggone it, I'm not getting back in the car. And I don't know, maybe it was shock. I didn't have any other words to say. I didn't know what to say, but at that point, there was a Christian police officer who was there that heard me speak at an event in town. And he told the officer to lower her gun. She refused to. He literally had to put his hand on her gun to make her lower it. And then he apologized for what happened. And I said, why did this happen? He said there was a bank robbery not too far from here. And there were 4 African-American males in jumpsuits driving a Cadillac. I said, I'm driving a 1968 Volkswagen that barely runs, and we're dressed up. How do we look like those suspects? And if so, 1 or 2 of you could have stopped us and asked us where we're going and what's going on. And then it goes into the 50s and 60s where you have more of that. Emmett Till's death in 1955. By the way, August 28th was the anniversary of his death. And they still have not arrested anyone for that boy's mutilation and murder. Accused of flirting with a white woman, maybe whistling, which later the white woman admitted Emmett Till didn't do any of that thing. But they came to his grandpa's house, his uncle's house at night, kidnapped him out of bed. They took this 12-year-old boy to a barn. They beat him. They crushed his genitals. They cut off pieces of his genitals. They cut off pieces of his ears, hit him over the head with an axe several times, right? And he was still alive before they finally shot him in the head and killed him and tied a heavy metal weight to his body and dumped him in the river. When his mother heard what had happened to her son and finally got help from the federal government in 1955 to bring the boy's body back up north to Chicago, the stink of that coffin, the smell of it, polluted the whole area. And the funeral director in the black neighborhood said, are you sure you want to open this? And she said, yes, I want it open. I want the world to see what they did to my boy. That was really the start of the civil rights movement in the 60s, when she had that open casket and people formed lines, black people from the community, and they saw his eye missing, his head cut, his body swollen. This handsome, beautiful 12-year-old boy was totally mutilated, right? Now, this is the 50s, and you have people say, why do you still feel that way when, I wasn't around during slavery and we didn't have slaves? Because the mentality and the attitude continued to go on. And later, everybody confessed in the 70s and 80s to what they had done to Emmett Till, but there were no arrests because of the double jeopardy law in the state. They couldn't be tried for the same crime. And so the federal government got involved. I believe it was 2004, 2014, 2017. And it ended with no criminal laws or arrest or any criminal violation. So I look at that and I say, how can you tell me that our country is still not struggling with racism today when we have an event in 1955 of a gruesome murder, confessions, in national magazines at the time, and nothing happened? They walk away. Does a black life really matter? Does a black life have any value? It's just such a conflict in my own mind. It just causes concern. And I think we are in this place today when we see these things happen in African-American communities and see these things happen to African-American males and females, such as Breonna Taylor. It just stirs inside of you this feeling of fear and camaraderie. And I think it was just this idea that privilege has been so much a part of our culture that so many people are blind to it and they don't understand the impact of it. And though the physical actions are not as extreme as they were when I was growing up, it still hangs in the air and it still clouds interactions between people.